Hello and welcome to Pricing College with your hosts Aidan Campbell
and Joanna Wells. Today we're going to speak about Rolex watches. Rolex watches are a key topic really, I suppose, in pricing, because they really do show the opposite of cost plus pricing. They don't use cost plus pricing, very much value based, because if they did use cost plus pricing, they would actually make much less profit than they're making today. But what really brought this topic to mind was a recent newspaper article on Rolex watches, in particular secondhand Rolex watches. Apparently, the bubble for secondhand Rolex watches has collapsed. And it got us thinking about the whole, pricing methodology, branding, marketing behind Rolex. And really, we were thinking about how, they really are still masters of value-based pricing. So we're just going to talk you through some examples today.
Yeah, I think we'll touch on some of the concepts that, I'm sure most people listening are not in the watch industry or the luxury goods industry, but just some concepts that I think we can highlight from Rolex. Like, I think the first thing we'd point out is when the Japanese quartz watch revolution, which basically is a battery in a watch, when that really came on, say, from the 50s and 60s, I think everybody expected the Swiss watch industry to literally disappear. It looked like being, what Netflix did to Blockbuster Video. The weird thing is that didn't happen, and even though in theory mechanical watches, whereby the inside of the watch is something that Rolex focuses on, you don't have to wind them, they're automatic winding, the move when you move your arm, with tiny little gears, etc. inside. In theory, that technology is obsolete. You can get a better watch that tells the time quicker, more accurately. You don't want it to tell the time more faster, obviously, but a more accurate timekeeping for probably just a Casio watch that might cost you $10. But the reality of it is that demand for luxury watches is probably higher than ever. And I suppose that is, what are we talking about here? We're talking, what are the themes that really highlight this? It's branding, it's brand management, it's status symbol, and it's really, I think, it's Rolex have dug into and really looked at the value drivers that people are using to look into their watch. So, I think the first one we'd probably talk about is branding.
Yeah, I suppose just looking back at what you were saying about the mechanical watch, and that's a brand in itself, that even though there is a better timekeeping alternative like the digital watch, people, like the novelty aspect of the mechanical watch. They like looking at the cogs and gears moving in the watch, and then they can sort of show their friends, and they can say, and people go, oh yeah, that's something different, and the difference is part of the branding appeal. It started off, I suppose, in terms of branding, looking at the mechanical aspects of a watch to differentiate the brand. But now Rolex has really moved into very micro branding through and very niche aspects based on functionality. Like, for instance, they've got the diver watch. They've got, all sorts of different types of watches for different utilities and for people's hobbies. So it's moved away from that more, tangible branding through the mechanical watch. And what it's made of. It could be, the gold trimming based on how people use the watch. So that's a very interesting and new development.
Yeah, I think that, for Rolex, really, I think when we think of Rolex, we think of status symbol. You're a captain of industry, you're the president, and I believe the presidents of America are given a separate watch, which is called a Rolex Presidential, I believe, and only presidents of the US are given them. But yes, status symbol. And I think this is what has led to the bubble in... clearly there are other mechanical watches. There are other luxury watches, even in Switzerland, even owned by the same company. Rolex makes Tudor watches also, which are a slightly cheaper price point. Some of the Japanese brands is Grand Seiko, obviously Omega, these sort of companies. But none of them hold the same status symbol. It's almost like a reserve currency or like gold that Rolex does. And why was there the bubble in second-hand Rolex watches? It was through history, I believe the price of Rolexes does not decrease when you in the second-hand market, as long as they are reasonably well maintained with the original box, with the original papers. Obviously, in the second-hand market, there would be counterfeit issues. But, for example, in China, a lot of people were buying Rolexes, as status symbols, but I would also argue potentially it's a store of value, to the same extent that a lot of people, in India traditionally would buy gold and have a lot of jewellery, invest a lot of their funds into gold. Basically it's a store of value and protection against inflation. And so that is maybe something that happened due to, the COVID crisis and people's, almost running to safe havens they might have seen Rolex watches as a safe haven. But clearly Rolex has, they have to really manage that brand, and that's what they are doing. They're limiting the number of watches released in any given year. I think our research says it's probably less than 1 million units a year, or between 700,000 and 1 million, roughly, people estimate, which has increased on previous years, but obviously the global population has also increased. So clearly they could sell a lot more watches if they wanted to, but that would probably decrease the brand. So they're doing that own, they're doing their own price, profitability analysis, I guess, there to maintain that. They're obviously restricting significantly how you can buy the watches. Not anybody can sell them. You have to be a registered dealer, and quite often you have to even be a registered buyer, where they're really restricting. It makes it difficult to buy a new Rolex. Certainly in the last couple of years, you would almost have to be on a waiting list. So there's restrictions that creates exclusivity. It makes people chase something when there's scarcity, and I think they really are masters in that. I think I'd also touch on the second-hand, the counterfeit market for these watches. Look, in theory, they are, or maybe I'll leave that one to Joanna. I think I'm talking more because I actually have an interest in watches. But one of the things I would say about the mechanical aspect that I do find strange, it's, if you go back to the 60s and said, the quartz is in, why would we have a mechanical watch? But people have kept interest in it. But I think it's the only area I can think where technology has moved on, but this area has almost kept it going. Like, it's not as if there's a market for, luxury cars with obsolete engines. That doesn't really happen. People want better engines. I can't think of any other device, and fundamentally a watch is a device that's designed to tell the time. It's a very simple, thing. But I can't think of anywhere else where we are using obsolete technologies and, putting them up and, giving them higher status. It's almost like a math or an intellectual hobby or pursuit, trying to make these more and more reliable but obsolete machines. So I find that strange, and I find the fact that we're still able to market it as a plus. If you go into a shop, many brands will sell mechanical and non-mechanical watches. The non-mechanical will be more accurate, but it actually costs less. So, you have to really think of the value drivers. Like, at the end of the day, you ask, why do you have a watch? To tell the time, but apparently that's not actually the reason at all.
Well, maybe there's some kind of psychology behind, this time, and people like actually seeing time move, and that mechanical watch does give people that element of control and seeing time move that the digital watch just really doesn't, potentially. But I really did find that interesting, and when you were talking, it reminded me of how watches really do have those psychological value drivers. You mentioned status, which is, I think, one of the number one drivers, psychological value drivers with Rolex. When you put that Rolex on, you're number one. And, Rolex has done a really good job in protecting their brand story, and protecting their price point. And they're actually really good at using price as a psychological signal or cue for value and status. They always are the top price, but they've actually organised their range to give people enough selection to get a Rolex at the lower end, without cannibalising the rest of their range, and keeping themselves exclusive and prestigious, which is a great piece of pricing work. And there's a lot of work that they've done with their price and product hierarchy to do that. So obviously they've got some great pricing people, but they've also really got some great product managers that know exactly what their range is, where it fits in the market, And they work very closely, obviously, with their pricing manager to really tease out the right price points, not just for individual attributes of that watch, but all those psychological value drivers that we talked about, status, putting a price on that without turning people away from the brand. So there's a number of things that, the team there are obviously thinking about. It's difficult stuff. It never stops, and they've always got to, like time itself, they've always got to think about their price points, because they'll constantly need to adjust those in relationship to the customer and the market and everything that we've just discussed. So, that was a really fascinating topic, Aidan.
Thank you. I detect sarcasm in the voice. Getting praise. Okay, so one thing I would say that I do find interesting is Rolexes, to some extent, are they're very expensive, but they're not the most expensive watch, and they probably are achievable if somebody really wanted them. There's a very large percentage of what we'd probably call high net worth individuals, in developed nations and globally really nowadays, who could in theory afford a Rolex if they really wanted one. Some of them probably start from the $10,000 market, that sort of thing. So people in theory could afford them. And at that price point, it's out of reach of the vast majority. It's a huge investment, but people know how much they cost. But it's still achievable. It's almost that sweet spot, and I'm sure they've thought about that to a great extent. The other thing I would say is quite interesting is the brand I mentioned earlier called Tudor, which traditionally was a lower. At the end of the day, these watches started back 100 years ago as actual functional watches. They weren't really luxury items, and the Tudor brand was more of an everyday person's watch who couldn't afford Tudor or who couldn't afford Rolex but still wanted a high quality watch. But what's interesting is they really relaunched that brand, say about 10 years ago, and when they relaunched it, the prices increased. They pushed the prices up, and when the prices increased, clearly the sales increased also. So they pumped more money into the brand. It's still an inferior brand to Rolex, but it's more of an everyday brand, but it still is increasingly, prices have increased. The perception people have of it has improved, and sales have increased also. And I don't know what profitability is, but I assume it has too. So again, that is, that's probably a good study on how you can almost build a brand, or reimagine a brand that, again, is in an obsolete technology industry. It's not the leading. It's got no real technological differences to other companies. They haven't invented a new way of telling the time, but they've just reinvigorated that brand. And, really with marketing, branding, positioning, those sort of aspects, which are, maybe some things that people sometimes ignore, really. The focus on technology, the pros, the features and benefits, I think is the term that pricers like to use. But, we're not. That's not what they did here. They pushed the hidden cachet, all that stuff. Just one final point is, I think Joanna mentioned how there's watches for divers and racers, and it almost is it's a bit sad, isn't it? A bit silly that all these very wealthy people are going to buy watches that are waterproof to 200, 300 meters, and you go, what percentage of them will even go 2 or 3 meters down? But it's they like to believe. It makes them think. Maybe the watch makes you think that you are an action man or a James Bond. So again, what are the real drivers? I think I'll leave it there today.
Yeah, and when you were speaking, though, it just really reminded me how important the concept of price anchoring is within the watch industry. As a person that wants to buy into Rolex but can't afford the top of the range, what they would do to entice those sort of people is use price anchoring by showing them almost like the top range first and then showing them the other option, which is still pretty good. And then psychologically you think, oh, actually, it's so much cheaper. Maybe I could afford that. I couldn't get the top brand version because it's too expensive, but I could afford this. And then gradually you're thinking, I could work my way up to the better brand. But that's what price anchoring does. It changes your behaviour into buying something that you wouldn't have thought of buying before. I'm thinking, actually, I've got a bargain at the same time. But really, if you take the old cost plus perspective at that point, you go, I'm buying something that it's way more than it's actually it costs. So I'm paying huge amounts for something that's literally all in my mind. It's all based on psychological value drivers, a status of being in this exclusive club. And even though you've just got the starter version, the cheaper starter version in the range, you're part of that members club, and they've got you buying that, changing your behavior, changing your mindset, utilizing a price point. So price anchoring is a very, very strong mechanism to change behaviors and also change mindsets and emotions towards a purchase. So think about that the next time. All the prices and product managers out there, maybe think about how you could use price anchoring like Rolex has to change your customer's viewpoint on your products. Anyway, well, that's. I think Aidan's got one more point that you'd like to share.
Yeah, this one's just a bit of a weird one, and I don't know how true this is, but talking about psychology, apparently all traditional watches with a face and hands, when they're shown in pictures, they're always shown with a time of 10 minutes to 2. And if you look in shops, I'll ask you to check, do you think that is always the case? Apparently they're shown at 10 minutes to 2 because psychologically it looks a bit like a smile. I don't know if that's the real reason. I've heard other arguments, but one of the reasons is it looks a little bit like the watch is smiling at you, and psychologically you like it more. Bizarre, if true, but worth consideration. So let's leave it there today, and have a great weekend.
Yeah, goodbye. Thanks a lot.